Welcome to Bite Size, a series where we talk to traffic and mobility experts, discuss innovation, and highlight business leaders within transport and city planning. Hello, my name is Emily Bobbis, and welcome back to another episode of the Bite Size podcast. Today's episode is a topic that I think afflicts a lot of us, and you're probably going to be a little bit surprised, but it's on parking. And I can hear some of you are probably just like, Emily, are you really going to talk about parking for 30 minutes? And I'm like, yes, I am, because our guest today makes it incredibly interesting. So I'm talking to the amazing Michael Doherty. Michael is the head of business development for Australia's award-winning parking technology developer, Smarter City Solutions. He has a 25-year track record working in overseas in the sales and the marketing of unique integrated parking solutions for local councils, universities, corporate clients, just all over Australia and beyond. So Smarter City Solutions is an established Australian software and technology service organisation that's absolutely leading the way with integrated parking systems. We also touch on the user side. So how do we create more frictionless, seamless, wonderful experiences for people when you're trying to find a parking spot and you don't want to have to go from your car to a ticket machine, then back to your car and then back again? I think particularly when we bring in the idea of tech, it gets people a little bit nervous because it can be very complicated. And if you don't come from a tech background, sometimes you have no idea what people are talking about. Michael does a fantastic job in talking about how we can enable people to embrace this disruption and see it as something that is for the greater good for everybody. Michael actually also gives a very practical tip about how to find cheap parking in a city. So if you're interested in nothing else, there is a practical tip in it for you if you listen in. So I hope you enjoy today's episode. So Michael, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So what I'm always really interested in is people's personal career journeys. So how did you get into your current role and kind of into parking in general?
Well, I think as most people in my industry agree, no one sort of wakes up as a student one day and says, I really want a career in parking. Everyone's pretty much ended up in the space in which I operate by accident. So I enjoy business and I enjoy applying technology solutions to business. I started my first business when I was 17. That was a mobile disco operation back in the late 80s. And I followed a little bit of a path there around technology, initially pro audio, and then around 2000 and Y2K was very much attracted to the IT space, looking at IT infrastructure. Made a few moves around in both hardware and software and really enjoyed software application development and taking that capability and applying it as a solution to a business problem. And then through being in the right place at the right time and also operating in a very early, I suppose, payment app scenario. This is sort of even before the iPhone was around. Mm-hmm. I found myself with an opportunity to head up a business here in Sydney that was a pay-by-phone app for the parking industry. So that's how I got into it about 8 or 9 years ago now. Yeah, and been in it ever since. Amazing.
So you've got the software background as well, which is interesting to kind of combine transport and software. Based on that experience, how do you apply, say, smart cities innovation or Internet of Things or technology to parking? I know there's been a lot of talk about the death of permits and stickers.
Yep, absolutely, and that's really what I get excited by is the ability to take a very old-fashioned business. You know, the first parking meter was implemented, I think, in the late 1940s. Wow. You know, and not a lot's changed in the industry, at least prior to me joining it. There has been the removal of human resources out of off-street car parks. We don't really pay the person in the booth as we're leaving an off-street car park anymore. So there's been some technology applied to that environment. But really, what we can do nowadays with the cloud and apps, as you say, removing the need for physical stickers and pieces of paper on the dashboards of cars, and simply allowing a motorist to interact with a range of different technologies through a browser or through a smartphone app, identifying their vehicle by the license plate. Every vehicle's got a license plate on it. It just streamlines life and makes that drudgery of parking more and more transparent. Someone's traveling somewhere and parking their car in order to do something a lot more exciting than parking. And parking can either be, in my view, pretty seamless and transparent, or it can be a bit of a pain, and we want to make it the former.
I think I saw it yesterday on Twitter, and I thought it tied in really well to our conversation. I don't know if you saw it. There was a guy called Gareth Wild, based in the UK, who posted what he called his Twitter magnum opus. And what he did is he spent 6 years parking at every single available parking spot at his local Sainsbury's. And he created a heat map of spots to avoid. And he's like, oh, don't park near the trolley bays. And then he's like, these are the average spots, but these are like the God tier spots, which you're aiming for a parking spot. These are the ones that you want. So it's, as you talked about the drudgery of parking, clearly there's this desire from consumers for well-designed parking.
Yeah, we just want it to disappear. I mean, yeah, he seems like a rare beast. There is a thing called a parking nerd, and it sounds like he fits the
Definitely. bill. Back on the idea of tech, and particularly buzzwords. So big data or smart cities are buzzwords not only in transport, but basically everything now. And I think for someone who doesn't have a tech background, these can be quite affronting to particularly someone who doesn't want to change, like, parking meters and all those kind of things. How do you enable clients to embrace these disruptions and see them not as like a personal attack on how they do business, but something that they can kind of take away personally and help do their jobs better?
Yeah, that's a great question, Emily. I think there is an adversity to change, and our client base is essentially levels of government. I talk to municipalities and councils a lot. They're an organisation that exists for their constituents, and their constituents range from highly tech-savvy youth through to elderly people that quite often in their very nature are adverse to change. And we, as an organisation, need to be really cognizant of that. So we always offer a transition, and B, a range of different options. It might be, for example, our parking payment solution is not just a smartphone app. You can actually dial a telephone number and interact with an interactive voice response system, an IVR, and park your vehicle that way. And on the transition side, we're seeing cities and campus parking providers as well. We do very well in the university space. We're seeing these parking operators go from a very large fleet of machines that spit out tickets to a much smaller fleet of what we call pay-by-plate machines. So rather than a motorist walking to a metal box, getting a piece of paper and returning back to their vehicle before they get on with their day, a pay-by-plate machine, you just walk past it, type in your plate, and you keep heading in the direction that you were heading in. So that in its very nature allows the organisation to have less of them. They don't need to be as close to the car. They just need to be as close to where people are generally likely to go. And to be honest, that provides a bit of street furniture for us to apply an information sticker explaining how to not even use that thing and use a smartphone app. Organisations are now embracing virtual permits. So again, a university campus environment, a staff member would salary sacrifice their parking, and as a result would get some sticker that would have holograms and other things on it that make it difficult to duplicate. We get rid of all of that, and we allow great flexibility to staff and students.
Definitely. It's funny, my mum is actually an academic, and they're just introducing that exact system you're talking about, that pay by plate, and she's happy about it because the amount of times that she would forget to bring her physical permit, or she'd bring it but forget to put it in the windshield, and then you get like a $90 fine, and it's just it gets really frustrating, and I think it removes an element of friction from the user experience, like you talked about, not having to go from your car to the machine, back to the car, and then maybe straight back past the machine to where you were going in the first place.
Everyone carries their smartphone now, right? You're not very likely to forget that like you are your parking permit.
How does or where does parking fit in with something like the share economy, or how that impacts on parking with ride sharing services?
It fits in really nicely, and we've partnered with a similar organisation to ourselves that manages the share economy, as you call it, when it comes to sharing a ride. So we've partnered with an Australian firm called Lift and Go, and their app is about connecting people. So if you're in a workplace that's got a very large number of employees and not a very large number of parking spaces, then there's a need for the organisation and the employees to really efficiently use the scarce resource of parking bays. And the way that seems to work quite well is to have a bona fide car share person or a ride share person that's travelling from home, from their suburb to the workplace and carrying a colleague, incentivising that by giving free parking, by giving heavily discounted parking. And up until just a few years ago, applying technology to that problem was somewhat difficult. We saw a few different attempts. One was to have those pass card readers, for example, one on the left and one on the right, where you had to tap simultaneously to get the boom gate to go up to let you into a car park. And you can imagine very quickly smart people end up with little telescopic rods with their mate who catches the bus. His card's going out the passenger window on a bamboo pole, and he's got his on the right. There was always these loopholes, but now with these complementary apps, we see that we can see where people are. They've travelled together. It's a bona fide ride share or carpooling, I should say, arrangement, and then we can, again, thanks to our integrations and technology in the cloud through APIs, we can have the two things working in harmony, and the business can achieve that desired result of an efficient use of the resource of parking.
Absolutely. It reminds me a lot of a statement I was talking to Rachel Smith in another podcast episode, and she basically frames the ethos of her work around real people, real problems, and real places. And it particularly with the idea of the bamboo pole and how the system is intended to work versus how people actually use the system is it's quite interesting sometimes to see what it was on paper and what actually happens.
Yeah. You've always got to manage the exceptions.
Yeah.
We talk about that a lot at Smarter City Solutions. There's what we call the happy path. When our engineers are designing the solution, it's okay. This is how it's going to work 90+% of the time when everything's fine. How are we going to deal with situations where something doesn't quite go right? And an example of that is a license plate recognition system. What if there's a four-wheel drive that's been out having some fun in the mud on the weekend and the technology can't actually read the plate? These things need to be thought of.
Yeah, definitely. My next question has a bit of like a personal anecdote attached to it, because it was like the story of how I came up with this question. So I don't have a car, so I don't drive a lot to kind of experience the joys of paying for parking. But in my research, I found that Australia is actually really quite expensive for parking. Like the average daily parking rates in Sydney CBD are some of the highest out of any capital city in Australia at like $70. And it got me thinking of a time where I went overseas. So this is where the anecdote comes in.
Right.
My partner is Canadian. So he's from a very small city called Victoria, which is on Vancouver Island, which, as the name suggests, is an island next to the city of Vancouver. And I was visiting his family for Christmas about 2-3 years ago now, and I wanted to check out the CBD. I haven't been to Canada, being a bit of a tourist. it reminds me a lot of Newtown. So in terms of scale, it's got really old historical buildings. It's really, really lovely. And we parked in the dead center of downtown. And I got really bad parking anxiety because we were there for almost 4 hours, Christmas rush, and I was panicking because I'm like, oh my God, this is going to cost an arm and a leg. We're parked right in the middle of downtown. And as we're driving down, exiting the parking lot, first of all, there was a lady actually sitting at the booth, which surprised me because I haven't seen that in a long time. And she took the ticket and then was like, all right, yeah, so your parking today will be $7. And
Wow.
yeah, I just had real culture shock. I'm like, that's so cheap. And I found it particularly interesting to compare Victoria, that city in Canada, and Sydney, because house prices are comparable to Sydney, and we also have the same issues of limited land use because it's an island. And it got me thinking about what are the factors that influence parking prices that make some places like Sydney so expensive and places like Victoria relatively just dirt cheap.
I think the short answer to your question is supply and demand. So Sydney's a very large city. It's very spread out. We're starting to see a shift in the last sort of 10 years or so of people residing very close to, if not in the CBD. But that's a new thing. Historically, and especially pre-COVID, because I think we're going to see some changes. But historically, people have travelled a fair distance to get to where they need to be in the city. And it's interesting when you break down what the actual cost of off-street parking comprises. There's taxes, first and foremost. There's a congestion levy, which I know the CEO of our industry body, Stuart Norman, is very passionate about lobbying government to change, and that seems to be something that is very prominent in Sydney and especially in Melbourne. The space, if you're referring to a basement car park, operated by one of the big name parking operators, they're either entering into one of two types of agreement. One is they just rent the car park the same way that a tenant up on level 14 would rent the office space, and that rent can actually be quite high. So it's the landlord and the owner of that building playing that supply and demand role. Or there's other agreements that are a little bit more sophisticated, where the parking operator and the landlord share risk and reward, and they might agree on some parameters on how to manage the pricing of that car park, how to manage the yield, and then share the prize. But at the end of the day, if you go into a car park, again pre-COVID, in Sydney, you will see that car park is over 80% utilised. And we've really only got ourselves to blame if, as motorists, we're driving into a city where, as you say, it's common to pay over $85 for a day of parking casually in a city. And the parking operators are just simply adjusting their prices based on how full the car park is, and if they remain full at those high prices, then both the owner of the building, who's generally not the backlit name on the wall when you drive up to the car park, and the operator, who is the name on the wall of the car park, are just essentially running a business on supply and demand. I'm operating more in the on-street world, as I said earlier, where I'm talking to councils and other on-street style of parking providers. But I do see in the off-street environment a big shift towards pre-booking. And that's a big tip for all the listeners. if you're needing to go into the city and it's something you may not do very often, give your details to one of the parking operators. Download their app and have a look at what's around, and you will save money. They're wanting to get you into their parking facility. They'd much prefer you do that rather than snag a chance spot on the street. And in return for you booking ahead and guaranteeing them some income, they give you a much better parking rate than if you just drive up as a casual and pull a ticket.
Interesting. That's a good tip as well. Might let my mum know about that, who has to drive into the CB all the time. So,
Yeah.
speaking of on-street parking and the congestion that can cause, this statistic might be a little bit out of date now, but I read an NRMA report that talked about like 30% of congestion around urban centres is just from people cruising around looking for parking. How do we minimise congestion caused by this behaviour?
We do it with technology. It's a commonly quoted statistic. I don't know how often it gets checked.
Yep.
It originated out of California somewhere, I believe, or somewhere in North America. But let's take it as fact. There's a large number of cars on the road that are cruising for a space, and it was probably very accurate back when that number started being quoted, and it's probably 10 years ago now. Why in this day and age, in the smart cities world where we've got a lot of data and we've got connectivity to the cloud, would a city or a parking provider or a technology company like us be happy for a motorist to be blindly hunting when they could be told the likelihood of availability? So there's a big move towards that. There's various technologies to sense whether an area of parking is fully occupied, partially occupied, or really in need of some cars to fill it up. And it's, again, the technology team that I work with are fantastic at taking a range of different inputs. They could be cameras, they could be cameras with some artificial intelligence, they could be in-ground sensors, even just a car park's existing technology where, it spits out tickets from the entry and you put them back in at the exit. There's data there that can tell you essentially in real time how full or empty that facility is. And I think we'll see a shift from here moving forward, from just having a what's called a scoreboard in the industry, a number out the front of, the Star casino car park, for example, saying we're full or we've got 100 bays available or whatever. We'll see that data move further out to the motor car, to the smartphone app, to the navigation, in apps like our Cello Park app, where not only are you using the app to pay for your parking, you'll be seeing where you need to go and avoiding those areas where you don't have a hope of getting a car space, and you're just contributing to that figure of 30% driving around looking for something, and you'll use the technology to again make parking become more transparent. Pull up, hit start, go to your meeting, come back, hit stop, just get charged for the parking that you've used, hop back in your vehicle, no doubt use your navigation app or your parking app, or a combination of the two, to go on to what you need to do next.
Yeah, okay, definitely. So on that idea of transparency, and you've mentioned your Cello Park app or Cello Parking app, what do you see as major barriers for this seamless parking and transportation experience?
I think there's a few different stakeholders that need to come together and work as a cohesive unit. So traditionally, the off-street providers have been extremely competitive, and telegraphing how full or empty your facility is to your competitor is simply historically not going to happen. And that's a function of private enterprise, right? So if you go to a city like Singapore, where largely the parking is operated by the government, then you'll see not only on a smartphone app, but you'll see on the freeway or the motorway, as you're heading from one part of Singapore to another, you'll see signs saying that this big car park under the exhibition centre's got bays available. This big car park over here near this big hotel is full, and that sort of thing's reducing their traffic greatly. We need to find a solution whereby those parking operators work together. The councils and local governments work with the private companies like ourselves to make that happen and to take that traffic off the road. And I think we really need organisations like the federal government and the state governments around Australia to act as an orchestrator, to put in place a framework whereby they encourage organisations like the one I work for, organisations like the councils, organisations that operate off-street car parks to all come together, form a platform, a standard, if you will, on how to exchange information. And we're starting to see this come out of the peak industry bodies in the US and the UK, whereby there's a data standard. We get encouraged or told or forced or whatever the mechanism is needed to all play in the same sandpit and provide information to the motorists, such that the city does become a true smart city.
You're not the first person as well to mention stakeholder cohesion, which is, I think, interesting. And I think it would actually benefit everyone involved, because I'm fairly certain one of the UN sustainability goals is this idea of collaboration between public and private entities. So it would be beneficial for basically everybody involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you take the New South Wales government, for example, they've got a digital initiative. There's a lot of things that they're doing around driver's licenses and fuel pricing apps. That's making people's lives easier, and there's a big drive to move away from paper and that sort of thing, which I absolutely applaud. But then when they look at parking, they essentially do the opposite of what you and I just spoke about, and they create their own app and they go and compete. They've missed the mark, and we need to really find a way to address that and get organisations like the one I work for, Smarter City Solutions, based in New South Wales, actually being part of the solution and working hand in hand with government rather than becoming a competitor and having our taxpayers' dollars compete.
Speaking of solutions and competing and having a bit of a messy sounding market, if you could redesign the concept of parking from the ground up, like if parking just kind of ceased to exist as we know it, what are the top 3 things you would do to kind of mitigate the current issues surrounding parking and parking infrastructure?
Oh, it's a really great question. I mean, if you could have your time again, you'd learn, right? And the one of the first things that comes to mind is the way that in Australia we deal with the disability parking permit, and it's just one example of a physical permit that really causes us a problem. There is wonderful technology available from a range of different companies that you can attach to a patrol vehicle, drive around and scan license plates. The technology converts it to text. We integrate with that stuff. We give it a database of parking rights to check in real time, a database of permits, a database of who's paid at a pay-by-plate machine, who's paid using a parking app, so on and so forth. And there is still certain elements of the parking world, and a disability parking permit is the most obvious one that comes to mind, whereby the holder of that permit is not encouraged to use a piece of technology like our V-Permit product. They're encouraged to place something on the dashboard of their vehicle that stops them essentially from getting an infringement. And when you take a sort of bird's eye view of parking and the mechanics of it and how it all works and can work using contemporary technology solutions, there's these little sticks in the mud, I call them, whereby the minority group that is the disabled people that are entitled to this permit are handed something that's very old-fashioned and stops the 100% efficiency of an otherwise fantastic and elegant technology-based solution from achieving its goals.
Amazing. So, Michael, thank you so much for taking the time out to chat today about parking and the new technology that's available and how that all fits into this broader umbrella of city planning.
Emily, it's been fantastic, and thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of the Bite Size Podcast. If you'd like to know more about Michael or Smarter City Solutions, you can visit their website, which is smartercity.com.au. Alternatively, if you'd like to know more about the Bite Size podcast or the company that produces the podcast, Compass IoT, you can visit our website, which is www.compassiot.com.au. Until next time.